Sallie Leland boarded the westbound train at St. Louis in the spring of 1878 with nothing but a carpetbag, a cracked heart, and a one-way ticket to a town she had never heard of before the previous Thursday, and she told herself that was exactly enough to start a life over from scratch. The promise had been made in the parlor of her father's house in Cincinnati, Ohio, with the scent of rose water in the air and the sound of her mother weeping soft, happy tears behind a lace handkerchief. Edmund Fitch had gone down on one knee in that parlor on a Thursday evening in February of 1878, and he had slid a gold ring set with a small garnet onto Sally's finger, and he had looked up at her with those pale, clever eyes, and said that she was the only woman in the world he would ever love. She had believed him. She had believed him the way a person believes in the warmth of a fire when they are standing right beside it, certain and unquestioning. She found out 6 weeks later, 2 weeks before the wedding was to take place, that Edmund Fitch had a wife already. A quiet woman named Agnes who lived in a boarding house in Indianapolis and who had written a letter to Sally's father because she had heard the wedding announcement in a newspaper that had found its way east and she could not in good conscience stay silent. Agnes Fitch was not cruel in her letter. She was matter-of-fact and a little sad, and that somehow made it worse. Sally's father had been furious. Her mother had taken to her bed. Edmund Fitch had come to the house that same evening and tried to explain something that had no explanation, and Sally had stood in the doorway of the parlor where he had proposed, and she had looked at him very steadily, and she had said, in a voice that did not shake even though every part of her wanted to come apart, that she needed him to leave and to never come back. He had left. He had not come back. He had also, as it turned out, taken with him the small amount of money Sally had saved from teaching piano lessons and had kept in a box in her bedroom, because Edmund Fitch was not only a liar but also a thief, and Sally had not known either of those things about him until it was almost too late. She had spent 2 weeks being very still and very careful while the gossip of the neighborhood worked its way around her like water moving around a stone. She had smiled at church and had helped her mother with the garden and had sat up 3 nights in a row unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of the city outside her window. And somewhere in those 3 sleepless nights, she had come to a decision that she knew was either the bravest thing she had ever done or the most desperate. She was going west. She had read enough about Kansas and Colorado and the territories beyond to know that the West had a quality that the East currently lacked in her specific case. And that quality was that nobody out there knew her name or her story, or the fact that she had almost married a man who was already someone else's husband. She sold the garnet ring at a pawn shop on a side street where no one would recognize her, and she used the money to buy her train ticket, and she told her parents only when the ticket was already in her hand. Her mother had wept again, but differently this time, with fear rather than happiness. Her father had argued for 2 hours and then, seeing the set of his daughter's jaw, had pressed $20 into her hand and hugged her harder than he had since she was a small girl and told her to be careful and to write. Sally had promised both things and meant them both. The train was loud and smelled of coal smoke and the breath of strangers, and it rocked and swayed across the wide belly of the continent for 3 days, and Sally sat by a window and watched the landscape change from the green and orderly east into something increasingly vast and untamed and golden. By the time Missouri gave way to Kansas, she felt like she was traveling into a painting, the sky so large above the flatlands that it seemed impossible, the grass moving in long waves like a sea that had forgotten it was not water. She had never seen so much space in all her 24 years, and it frightened her and thrilled her in equal measure, and she pressed her forehead against the glass and let herself feel both things without trying to pick one. She had chosen the town of Harlan's Creek, Kansas, for no more sophisticated a reason than that it had been mentioned in a letter from a woman named Mrs. Clara Boone, who had written an advertisement in a Cincinnati newspaper looking for a schoolteacher to fill a vacant post. Sallie had 2 years of teaching experience and a certificate from the County Board of Education in Ohio, and she had written to Mrs. Boone the same morning she had decided to go west, and Mrs. Boone had written back with impressive speed, saying that the position was available and paid $12 a month with a room above the general store included, and that was more than sufficient reason for a woman in Sallie's circumstances to get on a train and not look back. Harlan's Creek was not what the name suggested. There was no creek visible from the platform when Sallie stepped off the train on a Tuesday afternoon in late April of 1878, the air smelling of dry earth and something floral she could not identify. There was a main street with a row of clapboard buildings weathered to the color of old bone, a saloon with a painted sign that had begun to peel, a livery stable, a general store called Boone and Sons that she recognized from the name, a small church with a wooden cross, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered behind these businesses like afterthoughts. There were horses tied to hitching posts and a dog sleeping in the middle of the road, and 3 men in broad-brimmed hats sitting on a bench outside the saloon doing what appeared to be absolutely nothing with great commitment. Mrs. Clara Boone turned out to be a stout and decisive woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and a handshake that could have belonged to a man twice her size. She met Sallie at the platform with a wagon already hitched and ready, looked Sallie up and down once with sharp brown eyes and said, "You are younger than I pictured. Can you actually teach, or did you just say so to get a ticket west?" Sallie had said without flinching, "I taught 32 children for 2 years in Cincinnati and not one of them failed their county examinations. I can teach." Mrs. Boone had nodded once, satisfied, and said, "Good. Get in the wagon then. I will show you your room, and then you can meet the schoolhouse, which I am afraid is in need of a good cleaning." The room above the general store was small and square, and smelled pleasantly of cedar and dried herbs, and the window looked out over the main street of Harlan's Creek. And when Sallie set her carpetbag down on the narrow bed and looked out that window at the wide Kansas sky turning amber and rose in the late afternoon, she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not even fully realized was tight. It was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter than that, something more like the feeling of setting down a heavy thing you have been carrying for so long you forgot you were carrying it. She cleaned the schoolhouse that first week, hauled water and scrubbed desks and swept out the remains of a winter's worth of neglect, and she arranged the room the way she liked it, with the desks in careful rows and a world map tacked to the front wall beside the chalkboard, and she wrote her name on the chalkboard in her best hand and stood back and looked at it and felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to purposeful. The children came on Monday. 17 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 14, the children of farmers and ranchers, and the handful of tradespeople who kept Harlan's Creek running. They were curious about her in the way that children are, openly and without much pretense, and 2 of the older boys made a brief attempt to test whether she could be rattled, and she had dealt with that sort of thing before and knew exactly how to handle it, which was to look at the offending party with complete calm and ask them a question about long division that they could not answer, and redirect the energy of the room before embarrassment became defiance. By Wednesday she had the respect of 17 children, which was, as she knew from experience, no small accomplishment. She settled into a routine, school in the mornings and early afternoons, supper most evenings with Mrs. Boone, who turned out to be not just her employer but a genuinely warm and forthright woman who had come west herself 20 years earlier with her husband Thomas, who had since passed from a fever that had taken him in the winter of 1874, leaving her the store and the sons who helped run it. Clara Boone had no patience for self-pity in herself or others, but she had a great deal of practical sympathy, which was in Sallie's view considerably more useful. She did not ask Sallie why she had come west. She waited, in the way of a woman who had learned patience from necessity, and Sallie was grateful for that. It was on a Friday afternoon in her third week in Harlan's Creek that Sallie first saw Roy Hale. She had walked to the far end of the main street to post a letter to her mother, one of the regular letters she had promised, and she was coming back past the livery stable when a horse came down the street at a canter, ridden by a man who sat in the saddle like he had been born there, easy and straight. And the horse was a dark bay with a white blaze, and the man was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and a worn brown hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He drew the horse up at the hitching post in front of the general store with an unhurried pull of the reins, swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, looped the reins around the post, and then looked up and found Sallie watching him from perhaps 15 feet away. He did not look away or tip his hat immediately, which was what she had expected. He just looked at her for a moment with level dark eyes, the way a person looks when they are genuinely surprised to see something they had not expected, and then he did tip his hat, a single courteous motion, and he said, "Good afternoon." Sallie said, "Good afternoon," and kept walking, because she was not in any state of mind for anything more than that, and also because she was a woman who had learned in recent months to be considerably more careful about the things she allowed herself to feel about a man's face. She mentioned it to Mrs. Boone that evening only in passing, asking who the man was who had ridden in on the dark bay, and Mrs. Boone had said, without looking up from the beans she was shelling, "That will be Roy Hale. He runs the Double H out past Miller's Ridge, about 8 miles north. Good man. His father started the ranch and Roy took it over when his parents passed a few years back. Runs about 400 head. Comes into town for supplies most Fridays." She paused and then added, with the careful neutrality of someone who is not trying to say something but is saying it anyway, "He is a decent, honest man, Sallie. There are fewer of those out here than there ought to be, but Roy Hale is one of them." Sallie said, "I am sure he is," and changed the subject, and did not think about Roy Hale's level dark eyes again that night except the once, just before she fell asleep, and she told herself it was only because the day had been long. The following Friday he came into the general store while Sallie was there buying a new piece of chalk and a box of drawing pins for the schoolroom, and Mrs. Boone, who was behind the counter and who Sallie was beginning to suspect of a certain quiet maneuvering, introduced them with the brisk efficiency of someone checking an item off a list. "Roy, this is Miss Sallie Leland. She is our new school teacher, came out from Ohio in April. Miss Leland, Roy Hale. He runs the Double H north of town." Roy Hale took off his hat, which Sallie noticed showed a pale line across his forehead where the sun had not reached, and he said, "Miss Leland, I heard we had a new school teacher. My ranch hand Cobb has a boy in your school. Says the boy actually came home enthusiastic about arithmetic last week, which I understand is some kind of miracle." Sallie felt the corner of her mouth pull up before she could stop it. "Tommy Cobb. He has a real talent for numbers, but he did not know it yet because no one had asked him to find it." Roy Hale smiled then, and it changed his whole face, softened something in it that the weather and the years of outdoor work had made look permanently serious. "That is a good way to teach." "It is the only way I know," Sallie said, and she paid Mrs. Boone for her chalk and her drawing pins and said a polite goodbye to them both and walked back to the schoolhouse in the clear Kansas afternoon, and this time she thought about Roy Hale's smile for the rest of the day and acknowledged to herself, with some irritation, that she was going to have to be very careful indeed. The problem, she understood, was not that she did not trust her own judgment. The problem was that she had trusted her own judgment completely about Edmund Fitch, and her judgment had been spectacularly wrong. And the woman who had stood in a Cincinnati parlor and believed with her whole heart in a man's promise was not a woman who existed anymore in quite the same form. In her place was Sallie Leland of Harlan's Creek, Kansas, school teacher, practical woman, person with a job and a plan, and absolutely no interest in being made a fool of twice. She repeated this to herself with some regularity through the month of May, while Roy Hale came into town every Friday and invariably found some occasion to exchange a few words with her, never pressing for more than a few words, never giving her the uncomfortable sensation of being pursued. He asked once about how the children were getting on and listened genuinely when she told him. He stopped one afternoon when she was struggling with a wagon wheel that had slipped its rim while she was helping Mrs. Boone's son James move some supplies, and he fixed the wheel with the quiet competence of a man accustomed to fixing things, and refused to make a fuss about it. He brought a small paper of horehound candy for the children once, handing it to Sallie with a slight air of embarrassment, saying that his ranch hand Cobb had suggested it, and he had thought it was not a bad idea. Sallie had taken the candy and said thank you and looked at him, and thought that a man who would bring candy for other people's children, because his friends suggested it, and then look embarrassed about it, was either very kind or very good at appearing kind. And she had decided, with the determination of a woman protecting a scar, that she was not going to decide which one it was until she knew a good deal more. June came, and the heat with it, the Kansas summer settling down on the land like a heavy blanket, the sky turning white at midday, the air smelling of dry grass and hot earth. Sallie taught through the heat with the schoolhouse windows open and a pitcher of water on her desk, and the children flagged in the afternoon sessions, and she learned to put the harder work in the mornings and let them do things like drawing maps or reading aloud in the slower, hotter hours. She was good at it, she knew. She had always been good at reading a room and adjusting to what it needed, and she found that skill translated from the polished parlors of Cincinnati to a dusty Kansas schoolroom without any loss in the translation. On a Saturday evening in mid-June, Mrs. Boone's older son Daniel held a small gathering at his house on the edge of town to celebrate his wife Mabel's birthday, and Sallie was invited along with most of Harlan's Creek's small population. There was food and music, a fiddle player named Otis Greer who was 70 if he was a day and who played with more feeling than technique, and people danced in the cleared space of Daniel Boone's front room, the furniture pushed back to the walls, the lamp light warm and unsteady. Roy Hale was there. He stood with a small group of ranchers for a while and talked in the way that men talk at gatherings, seriously and with long pauses, and he did not seem particularly interested in dancing, which Sallie noted only because she herself had been asked twice and declined both times, being content to stand near the window where there was a breath of cooler air and watch people be happy together. She liked watching that. It was not loneliness exactly, or it was not only loneliness. It was the pleasure of an observer, and she had always been partly an observer, even in the middle of her own life. Roy Hale came to stand near the window somewhere in the middle of the evening. Not right beside her, not intrusively close, but near enough to be companionable, and he looked out the window for a moment at the dark Kansas night and said quietly, "The stars are something out here, different from back east." Sallie looked at him and then out the window at the sky, which was indeed extraordinary, the Milky Way visible as a great dense sweep of light from horizon to horizon. "I grew up in Cincinnati," she said. "I had never seen the sky like this before I came here." "It is the flatness," he said. "Nothing to block it. My mother used to say the West traded walls and trees for sky, and she thought that was a good trade." He paused. She had come from Virginia originally. She missed the trees sometimes. Did she come to love it, the West? Sallie asked, and she asked because she genuinely wanted to know, and also because she was realizing she wanted to know more things about Roy Hale than she had been permitting herself to want to know. "She did," he said. "Not right away. It took her a couple of years, but she said eventually that she could not imagine being anywhere else, that the space had gotten into her somehow and she could not have gone back to feeling hemmed in." He looked at Sallie then with those level dark eyes. "Have you had that feeling yet, or is it still strange?" Sallie considered this honestly. "Some mornings I look out my window and the sky is pink and the land goes all the way to the horizon in every direction, and I feel like I could breathe all the way to the bottom of myself," she said. "I did not know I had not been breathing that way before." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is it exactly." And the simplicity of it, the way he accepted what she had said without embellishment or performance, made something in Sally's carefully guarded chest do a slow, complicated thing that she did not immediately have a word for. They stood together by that window for another half-hour, talking in the easy, unhurried way of two people who are discovering the pleasure of a good conversation and are in no hurry to end it. He told her about the ranch, the Double H, which his father Amos Hale had started in 1869 with a small herd, and a section of land north of what had become Harlan's Creek, and which Roy had expanded slowly and with great care after his father's death in 1875, and his mother's death the following winter from pneumonia. He spoke about his parents without either excessive grief or excessive stoicism, just directly, the way a person speaks about something real that has become part of them. He was 29 years old, he mentioned when she asked, and he had grown up on the land and could not imagine wanting to be anywhere else. Sallie told him about teaching in Cincinnati. She did not tell him about Edmund Fitch. She was not ready for that, and she was not sure she would ever be ready for it, and she told herself that was her own business, and the fact that she was being careful did not make her dishonest. She could tell what she chose to tell. That was allowed. But something had shifted that night at Daniel Boone's house, and she knew it and tried to be sensible about it. She walked home in the warm night air with Mrs. Boone, who said nothing pointed or suggestive about anything, which made Sallie fairly confident that she was being very pointed and suggestive in the privacy of her own thoughts, and Sallie lay in her narrow bed above the general store and looked at the ceiling and told herself very firmly that she was going to be rational about this. She was not particularly rational about it. Through July, she found herself looking forward to Fridays with a specificity that was inconvenient. She noticed when Roy Hale's horse was at the hitching post before she arrived at the store, and she noticed when he seemed to arrive later than usual, and she noticed the quality of the half-hour or hour when their paths crossed, the easy back and forth of two people who had discovered that they thought somewhat alike about certain things and were still discovering where they thought differently, which was also interesting. He was more deliberate than she was, more inclined to silence before speaking. She was faster and more likely to say something before she had thought it entirely through, and he seemed to find this not alarming but entertaining, and she found his deliberateness not dull but steadying, which was a quality she had not known she was looking for. In the second week of July, Tommy Cobb's father, Pete Cobb, the ranch hand at the Double H, came into the schoolhouse at the end of a school day and asked Sallie if she would consider coming out to the ranch on a Saturday to help his boy Tommy with some reading that the boy was finding difficult. Pete Cobb was a slight, weathered man with a permanently apologetic manner, and he made the request with such elaborate diffidence that Sallie almost felt sorry for him, and she said of course she would come, that she had been meaning to visit some of the children's homes when she could, and Pete Cobb said Roy would send a wagon for her if that was acceptable, and Sallie said that was perfectly acceptable. And she went home and spent more time than she would admit deciding what to wear on a visit to a working ranch on a summer Saturday. Roy came himself with the wagon rather than sending someone, which she had not expected, and which she appreciated without saying so directly. The drive out to the Double H took the better part of an hour, and the land north of town was beautiful in a way she was still learning to see, the grass summer golden, the sky enormous, the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees along the dry watercourses marking the landscape like punctuation. Roy drove and they talked, and the conversation was comfortable in the way that conversations become when two people have been practicing them for several weeks and have found the particular rhythm that belongs to them. The ranch itself was more substantial than she had imagined from the description. The main house was a low, solid structure of stone and timber, built close to the ground against the Kansas wind, with a broad porch on 3 sides and windows that faced south to catch the light. There were outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a barn, a smokehouse, all in good repair, all with the look of a place that was cared for consistently rather than sporadically. The yard was swept clean, and there was a kitchen garden along the south side of the house with rows of beans and squash and tomatoes coming along in the heat. Pete Cobb's wife Ruth met them at the gate, a small woman with quick hands and a warm, direct manner, and Tommy was there too, barely containing his excitement at having his teacher come to his house, which made Sallie smile. She spent 2 hours with Tommy, sitting on the porch while Ruth brought them lemonade, and the afternoon moved in long golden strips across the floorboards. Tommy's difficulty was not with reading itself, but with something she recognized from other children, a kind of anxiety about performance that made the words on the page seem to swim when eyes were on him. She had seen it before and knew how to handle it, sitting beside him rather than across from him, making it a shared task rather than an examination. And by the end of the 2 hours, he had read 3 pages of a McGuffey reader aloud with real fluency, and was so pleased with himself that his face was luminous. Roy had been working in the barn for most of that time, visible through the open doors doing something practical with rope and an equanimity that Sallie found, when she happened to look that way, thoroughly distracting. He emerged when she was finished with Tommy, wiped his hands on a cloth, and asked if she would like to see the property before they drove back, and she said she would. He showed her the south pasture, where 100 head of cattle moved in a slow drift through the grass, and the northern water tank that his father had built, and that he had repaired and expanded, and the place along the creek bed where the cottonwoods grew thick enough to make real shade, and they stood in that shade in the late afternoon with the sound of the water that was just barely still running at this time of year. And Roy said, with a care that she could hear under the casualness, "I am glad you came out. The place looks better to me when I see it through someone else's eyes," Sallie said. "It is a fine ranch, Roy. You should be proud of it." He looked at her then for a moment with something in his face that was not quite what had been there before, something more open, and he said, "I have been thinking since last month about whether I was reading you right, whether I was seeing something that was there or something I wanted to be there." Sallie's heart did something entirely unhelpful. She said carefully, "What do you think you have been seeing?" He said, equally carefully because he was a careful man, "That you are someone worth knowing. And that you have been kind enough to let me know you, which I do not take for granted. And that there is something keeping you careful, and I do not mean to push at whatever that is." He paused, "But I wanted to say it plain, that I am interested in knowing you better, Miss Leland, if that is something you would be willing to consider." Standing in the shade of the cottonwoods with the sound of the thin summer creek and the late light coming through the leaves, Sallie Leland looked at Roy Hale and thought about Edmund Fitch and his clever pale eyes and his particular ability to say beautiful things that were not true. And she thought about the ring she had sold at a pawn shop, and the 3 sleepless nights and the train west, and the room above the general store, and the 32 children, and the 17 children, and the wide Kansas sky that had let her breathe all the way to the bottom of herself. And she thought that she was 24 years old and that she had come west to start over, and that starting over was a thing you did with courage, or you did not really do it at all. She said, "I want you to know that I am not uncomplicated, Roy. I came west for reasons I have not talked about. There is something I have been through that made me wary. I am telling you this because I think you deserve to know it, and because I am not willing to let wariness be the whole story of what I am." He looked at her steadily and said, "I did not come to know you thinking you were uncomplicated. I came because complicated things are generally the ones that are worth knowing." And something in Sallie Leland, which had been wound very tight for a very long time, unwound just a little further. She told him about Edmund Fitch on the drive back to town. Not everything all at once, but the shape of it, the engagement, the discovery, the theft, the decision to go west. She told it plainly, the way she had learned to tell hard things, without excess emotion but without pretending it had not mattered. Roy drove and listened with the steady attention he gave to everything, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He was a fool and a coward, and you are well rid of him. And I am sorry it happened to you. And I am glad you came west." Sallie had expected to feel exposed after telling it, which was why she had been putting it off, but she did not feel exposed. She felt lighter. She looked at the darkening sky above the flatlands and felt lighter than she had since February, which was something she could not have predicted and which she was going to allow herself to feel without arguing with it. She allowed things to be different between them after that. They began to take occasional Sunday afternoon walks after church, which was the respectable way that a woman and a man in a small Kansas town in 1878 managed to spend time together in public, without generating more conversation than was useful. The walks were along the road north of town, or around the edge of the flat grassy commonland behind the church, and they talked in the way they had been talking, but more freely now, with more of themselves in it. He told her about a cattle drive he had done in 1876, taking a small herd north along the Kisham Trail to a railhead at Abilene, a 2-month journey through weather and terrain that had tested everyone involved, the heat and the lightning storms and the river crossings, and he described it the way a man describes something that was genuinely difficult and also genuinely alive. And Sallie listened, and thought that the life Roy Hale had lived was very different from anything she had known, but that its texture, its insistence on honest work and clear-eyed dealing with difficult things, was something she recognized and respected. She told him about her father and about teaching piano lessons to the neighborhood children before she had gotten her certificate, about the particular small glory of watching a child play their first simple song all the way through without stopping. She told him about the things she had read, and he was not a man who read a great deal, but he was a man who was genuinely interested in ideas, and they could talk about anything from the price of beef, to the nature of courage, to whether Kansas would ever become as settled as Ohio, and what would be lost, and what would be gained when it did. In August she said yes when he asked her to supper at the ranch house, and Ruth Cobb cooked and Pete Cobb and Tommy sat at the table too, and it was a warm and ordinary evening in a low-ceilinged stone house in the middle of the Kansas prairie. And afterward Roy and Sallie sat on the porch in the dark for an hour while the stars came out, and he said, very quietly, "Sallie." Just her name. Nothing else immediately. And she said, "Yes." And he reached over and took her hand in both of his hands large and calloused and warm, and held it without any fuss, just held it. And they sat there in the dark with the sound of the cattle in the south pasture and the night insects, and the enormous quiet of the land all around them, and it was the most peaceful Sallie had felt since before she could quite remember. She thought about trust that night, lying in her narrow bed with the window open to the warm August air. She thought about what it meant to trust again after the thing with Edmund Fitch, whether it was foolishness or courage, or just the simple fact that some people deserved trust, and recognizing that was not the same as being naive. Roy Hale was not Edmund Fitch. They were not the same kind of person in any way she could identify. Edmund had been smooth and certain, and had said everything perfectly. Roy was deliberate and direct, and sometimes sat with something for a long time before he said it at all. Edmund had told her she was the only woman in the world he would ever love, and had meant none of it. Roy had said she was worth knowing, and that he did not take her kindness for granted, and she believed both of those things with a certainty that came from somewhere different than the place where she had believed Edmund, somewhere quieter and more stable, like bedrock instead of sand. September brought cooler mornings, the light changing to something more golden and lateral, the grass beginning to brown at the tips. School resumed after the summer break with 18 children now, a new family having come to Harlan's Creek from Missouri in the interim, a family named Whitfield with 2 red-haired boys who turned out to be clever and energetic, and kept Sallie on her toes in the best possible way. The days filled up again with the rhythm of teaching, and the Friday afternoons with Roy, and the Sunday walks, and letters to and from her mother in Cincinnati, who had by now recovered from the shock of her daughter's departure enough to be cautiously supportive, and who asked in every letter if there was anyone interesting in Harlan's Creek, a question Sallie answered with increasing obliqueness. She wrote to her mother in October and said there was a man she was getting to know, and that she thought he was someone good, and her mother wrote back within the week with what Sallie could tell was restrained excitement and a great many sensible questions that Sallie answered honestly. The thing that happened in October was not planned by anyone, and it was the kind of thing that could have gone wrong but did not. And afterwards Sallie thought that the way Roy handled it told her more about who he was than anything he had said or done before. There was a man in Harlan's Creek named Clyde Garver who ran a small trading operation of uncertain character from a building at the far end of the main street, and who had the distinction of being the person in town whom everyone was mildly uneasy about without being able to point to a specific thing he had done. He was broad and loud, and had a way of looking at things that did not belong to him with an appraising eye, and he had on 2 occasions said things to Sallie in the street that were not directly offensive but were in the vicinity of offensive, and she had dealt with them the way she dealt with most things, calmly and without drama, but she had not liked them. In the middle of October, on a Friday afternoon, Garver came into the general store while Roy was there getting his supplies and Sallie was there posting a letter, and Garver made a remark to Sallie that was frankly and specifically offensive in a way that made Mrs. Boone go very still behind the counter. Sallie turned and looked at Garver with a directness that she had been cultivating since February, and she told him in a clear, even voice that he had been impolite, and she expected him not to speak to her in that manner again. Garver laughed and said something else that was worse. Roy Hale, who had been standing 6 feet away loading a sack of flour onto his shoulder, put the flour down. He did it slowly and deliberately, and then he turned and looked at Garver, and Sallie had never seen Roy's face look quite like it looked in that moment, which was entirely still and entirely serious in a way that was more effective than any amount of loudness. He said, "Mr. Garver, the lady has told you plainly what she expects. I'm going to ask you to do what she says." Garver made a sound that was meant to be dismissive. Roy said, without raising his voice at all, "I am not asking twice." There was something in the quality of that statement that communicated itself to Garver more clearly than volume would have, and he left the store with considerably less bluster than he had entered it, and the door closed behind him, and Mrs. Boone let out a long breath and said, "Well," and then went back to her business. Sallie looked at Roy. He was picking up the sack of flour again, his face resuming its ordinary expression, and he looked at her once and said, "I am sorry that happened." "You did not cause it," she said. "No, but I am sorry you had to deal with it." He said it without making it into a speech, and that, too, was exactly right, because he knew she was not a woman who needed to be told she had been wronged in order to know it herself. He had simply made it stop and said he was sorry, which was precisely the right 2 things to do. She told Mrs. Boone later that evening that she thought she might be falling in love with Roy Hale, and she said it partly because she needed to say it out loud to someone, and partly because Mrs. Boone was the person she most trusted in Harlan's Creek. And Mrs. Boone looked at her with those sharp brown eyes and said, "I have thought so for some time. He has been in love with you since about June, if you want my opinion." Sallie said, "I do want it," and Mrs. Boone said, "Then go tell him," and went back to her knitting. She did not go tell him that day because she was not impulsive even when she wanted to be. But she did, on the following Sunday walk, take his arm when they had been walking for a little while, the way couples did, just slipping her hand through the crook of his elbow, and she felt him look at her with some surprise and then something warmer than surprise, and he covered her hand with his for a moment, And they walked like that along the road north of Harlan's Creek with the October sky enormous and blue above them, and the dry grass rustling on either side. And Sallie felt the whole of the moment with a clarity that she knew she would remember. He said, that afternoon, "I want to ask you something and I want to do it properly." "I have been thinking about how to do it properly for a month," Sallie said. "You could just ask it." He looked at her with a slight smile at the corner of his mouth that she had come to know and love and said, "I am aware that is an option. I am working up to it." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and it surprised her, the ease of it. And he watched her laugh with an expression that made her feel seen in the way that she had decided, sometime in the last several months, was the only way she wanted to be seen by anyone for the rest of her life. He asked her on a Sunday evening in late October, on the porch of the Double H where they had taken to sitting, after she began spending more Sunday afternoons at the ranch. He had clearly done some thinking about the doing of it, because he was serious in a way that was different from his ordinary seriousness, more careful, and he said, "Sallie, I want to ask you to marry me, and I want to be honest with you about what that means before you say anything. It means this ranch, which is a good life but a hard one. It means Kansas winters and cattle work and a house that is comfortable but not what you were used to in Ohio. It means a man who is not a smooth talker and never will be. It means that I will work every day to be honest with you and true to you in every way that a man can be true to a woman." He stopped and looked at her directly. "I want it to be your choice made with your eyes open. I do not want to talk you into anything. I just want you to know what I am offering." Sallie looked at this man who had just described himself with more accuracy and honesty than most people could manage about themselves. This man who had fixed a wagon wheel and brought candy for children, and told a bully to leave without raising his voice. This man who had listened to her tell the worst thing that had happened to her, and had said only that she was well rid of Edmund Fitch, and that he was glad she had come west, and she thought that open eyes were exactly what she had. She had earned open eyes. She said, "Roy, I came west because a man broke a promise to me, and I needed to find something I could build on that was solid. I have found it. I have found it here, and I have found it in you. Yes, I will marry you." He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was one of such pure and unguarded happiness that it undid the last of the careful caution she had been keeping around her heart like a fence. And then he took both of her hands in his and held them, and after a while he said quietly, "Thank you, Sallie." Just that. "Thank you, Sallie." Which was, she thought, the most Roy Hale thing he could possibly have said, and she loved him for it completely. They told Mrs. Boone the next morning. Clara Boone looked at Sallie for one sharp, assessing moment and then said, "Good," and hugged her with the considerable force her arms were capable of, and then immediately began discussing practical matters in the tone of a general planning a campaign, which was also the most Clara Boone thing she could have done, and Sallie found herself laughing again. They were married in the small church in Harlan's Creek on the 14th of December, 1878. The day was cold and bright, the sky the clear hard blue of a Kansas winter, the ground frozen and ringing underfoot. Sallie wore a dress of dark green wool that Ruth Cobb had helped her make from fabric that Mrs. Boone had ordered from the nearest city as a gift, and she carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers that Ruth had kept from the summer and tied with a ribbon. The church was filled with most of the people of Harlan's Creek, because small towns in 1878 had a collective investment in weddings that was not really about gossip, but about the pleasure of seeing two people make a genuine choice in front of their community. Sallie's mother and father had been told by letter, and her mother had cried. She wrote back, and her father had asked 3 specific questions about Roy Hale's character and finances, and been satisfied with the answers Sallie provided. And he had written a separate letter to Roy that Roy had read twice, and then folded and put in the inside pocket of his coat. And when Sallie had asked what it said, he had told her that her father had said he trusted Roy to take care of Sallie, and that he expected that trust not to be misplaced, and that he was glad his daughter had found someone worth coming west for. Roy had said, reading that he intended to make good on it, and Sallie had had absolutely no doubt that he meant it. The minister was a young man named Reverend Cross who had come to Harlan's Creek only that autumn and who had a genuine warmth under his formal manner, and he read the words of the service with feeling. And when he asked Roy if he took this woman, Roy looked at Sallie the whole time he said yes, the way a man looks at something he is saying yes to with his whole self. And Sallie said yes to the same question with the same wholeness, without any hesitation or caveat or condition. Just yes, because she had decided, and she was certain, and certainty, the real kind built from knowledge rather than assumption, was one of the finest things a person could feel. The ring Roy put on her finger was a simple gold band, no stone, which was exactly right, and she looked at it on her hand afterward and felt none of the things she had felt looking at Edmund Fitch's garnet ring, which had been beautiful and meaningless. She felt the weight of something real. They celebrated at Mrs. Boone's house afterward, a good loud gathering with Otis Greer on his fiddle and tables of food that the women of Harlan's Creek had contributed to in the way of communities that are small enough to be genuinely generous. Roy danced with her twice, which surprised her because she had not thought of him as a dancer, and he was not one in any technical sense, but he was steady and present, and he held her with a care that was also confidence, and those two things together were what dancing was supposed to be. They drove out to the Double H in the late afternoon in a wagon that Pete Cobb had decorated with pine branches, because it was December, and that was what he had to work with, and the sun was setting as they came north along the road, the sky going pink and amber over the brown grass, the stone house ahead of them with smoke coming from the chimney because Pete had lit the fires before leaving, and Roy helped her down from the wagon, and they stood in the cold evening air looking at the house, and he said, "Welcome home, Sallie Hale," and she looked up at him and said, "That sounds right," and it did. The first winter at the Double H was not easy. Kansas winters were something a person from Ohio understood theoretically but not physically until they experienced them. The wind that came down from the north with nothing to slow it, the temperature dropping so fast some nights that the water in the barrel by the back door froze before morning. Roy had warned her. He had not exaggerated, and he had not minimized. The house was solid and the fireplaces worked, and there was a good supply of wood and coal and food, laid in for the months when the road to town became difficult or impossible. Sallie was not a woman who had been raised to be delicate, and she adjusted to the reality of a ranch winter with the same practical energy she brought to everything, learning what needed doing and doing it, learning where the cold came in and blocking it, learning to read the weather and the quality of the light on the southern horizon the way Roy did without even seeming to think about it. What surprised her was how much she loved it. Not the cold itself, which was simply a fact to be managed, but the quality of the life it enforced, the way a hard winter pulled you inward and made the small circle of warmth you had created together feel extraordinary. Evenings by the fire with Roy reading the newspaper that came weekly from Wichita and Sallie writing letters, or preparing lessons for when school resumed in January. The particular companionable silence of two people who have found each other's company genuinely sufficient. The conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical and sometimes stayed somewhere in between for a long time. She learned things about him in that first winter that she had not had the chance to learn before. She learned that he woke very early before the light, that he was fully himself within minutes of waking where she needed half an hour of quiet. She learned that he was competent with tools and with animals to a degree she had not fully appreciated, that the management of a working ranch required a kind of constant problem-solving intelligence that she found genuinely impressive. She learned that he had a dry, quiet sense of humor that revealed itself most clearly in moments of difficulty, which she thought was the most useful kind. She learned that he took the welfare of the people who worked for him, Pete Cobb and the two other hands who stayed on through the winter, seriously in a way that was not paternalistic, but genuinely responsible. When Pete's wife Ruth came down with a bad chest cold in January, Roy drove to town through 6 inches of snow to bring back medicine from Mrs. Boone's store, and did not mention it afterward as a favor or a sacrifice. He had just done it. She told Roy in March, when the first signs of the Kansas spring were beginning to appear in the cautious way of a land that had been burned before, that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, over coffee, because that was where they were, and she was not a woman who staged things. He put down his cup and looked at her for a long moment, and then his face did the thing it did when he was feeling something deeply, going very still and then quietly luminous, and he said, "Are you well?" First, which was the first Roy Hale thing he could have said, and she said yes. She was well, very well, and he came around the table and held her with a gentleness that was also its own kind of strength. He wrote to her father and mother himself, and the letter that came back from Cincinnati was full of joy and plans for a visit in the summer if the journey could be managed. And it was managed. And in July of 1879, Sallie's parents came west for the first time. Her father wide-eyed at the scale of the land and quietly impressed by the ranch and by Roy in the way of a man who had been uncertain and has had his uncertainty resolved. And her mother immediately and thoroughly at home with Ruth Cobb and Clara Boone, who were exactly the sort of practical, warm women her mother understood and loved. The visit lasted 3 weeks and was a happiness that Sallie had not fully let herself anticipate, because she had not known how much she missed her parents until they were there. Her son was born in September of 1879, a Tuesday, early in the morning when the light was just beginning on the prairie. Ruth Cobb was there, and a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who had served as the nearest thing Harlan's Creek had to a midwife for 20 years, and Roy, who had insisted on staying close even when he was not permitted in the room, and who Sallie could hear through the door being quietly, completely calm in the way that she understood by now was how Roy managed fear. The baby arrived as the sun came over the horizon, and Sallie held him and looked at his furious, miraculous face, and felt a love so immediate and total that it was almost frightening in its intensity. They named him James Amos Hale, James for Mrs. Boone's son who had been a consistent and generous friend in Harlan's Creek, and Amos for Roy's father, who had built the thing that James would someday inherit. Roy held his son for the first time standing by the bedroom window with the morning sun coming in, and the ranch spread out behind the glass, and Sallie watched his face, and thought that this was the country you arrived at when you kept going after the worst thing, the country on the other side of broken promises and long journeys and careful choices made one by one, and that it was worth every mile of the getting here. Clara Boone came out to the Double H the following day and held James, and said with great satisfaction that he had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and was going to be a great deal of work and a great deal of joy in equal measure, and she was correct on all 4 points. The months that followed were full in a way that Sallie had not experienced before, full in the way of a life that has found its shape and is expanding into it. School resumed in October with 20 children now, and she taught through the autumn 5 days a week, and came home in the afternoons to James and Roy and the particular life of the Double H, which had its own rhythm and demands and satisfactions. Roy hired an additional hand in the spring of 1880, a young man named Diego Vasquez, who had come up from Texas with a letter of recommendation from a rancher Roy had done business with on the Kishom Trail years before. Diego was 22 and skilled with horses in a way that was immediately apparent, and he became over the following months a genuine asset to the ranch, and eventually a friend, one of the quiet long-term friends that working ranches generated, people whose lives became intertwined by proximity and shared labor, and the specific loyalty that comes from getting through hard things together. Clyde Garver, Sallie learned in the spring of 1880, had left Harlan's Creek in the winter, the details vague but involving some kind of dispute over a business transaction that had gone badly for him, and for which the outcome had not been in his favor. She felt no particular emotion about this, except a faint, practical satisfaction that the town was better ordered without him. Roy expanded the herd in 1880, a careful expansion negotiated with a rancher 40 miles north who was reducing his operation, and it brought the Double H to just over 600 head, which meant another cattle drive north in the fall, and Roy away for 6 weeks that Sallie managed with a combination of genuine competence and the honest acknowledgement, shared with Ruth Cobb over supper one evening, that she missed him considerably more than she had expected to, and that this was both inconvenient and, in some way she could not quite explain, also good to know. He came back from the drive in November with a bolt of blue silk he had found at a dry goods store in Abilene that he had no particular occasion to justify, but had bought anyway because it was the color of her eyes, he said, and he had thought she might like it. Sallie held the silk and looked at him and thought that he was not a man who said poetic things regularly, which meant that, when he did, the weight was different, and she told him she loved him with a directness that she had, over 2 years of marriage, gotten easier with, and he said he loved her back with the same directness which had always been there, had been there from early enough that she sometimes marveled at how long she had not let herself see it. And then they put James to bed and sat by the fire, and she told him everything that had happened in 6 weeks, and he listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, and the fire burned down to coals, and the November wind pushed at the windows of the stone house, and they were entirely, specifically, warm. The blue silk became a dress that Mrs. Boone, who had more sewing skill than she generally admitted, helped Sallie make in the winter evenings, and she wore it to the spring dance in Harlan's Creek in April of 1881, which was an annual event that had grown more elaborate each year as the town had grown, a proper dance now at the newly built hall beside the church, with a small ensemble of musicians instead of just Otis Greer and his fiddle. Though Otis Greer was still there, and still played with more feeling than technique. Roy danced with her more than twice this time, because he had been practicing, which she had discovered by catching him one evening counting steps in the barn with patient concentration, and she had not mentioned it, and he had not said anything, and the dancing itself was better than it had been at Mabel Boone's birthday party 3 years earlier, which was the kind of detail that made her love him in a very specific and uncomplicated way. In the summer of 1881, Sallie's sister Margaret came west for a visit, the first of her Cincinnati family to make the journey other than their parents. Margaret was 21, unmarried, bright, and somewhat restless in the way of a woman who has more capacity than her circumstances are using, and she came expecting to be politely entertained and ended up spending 3 weeks in a state of genuine absorption. She helped Sallie in the schoolroom one morning and discovered that she was good at it, better than she had expected. She rode with Roy out to the north pasture and came back flushed and elated and full of questions about the cattle operation. She had long conversations with Clara Boone that Sallie was not entirely privy to. She played with James, who was almost 2 and thoroughly engaging, with an enthusiasm that went beyond polite auntly interest into something more genuine. On her last evening sitting with Sallie on the porch of the Double H while Roy put James to bed inside, Margaret said, "You did the right thing coming here, Sallie. I did not understand that before. I thought you were running away." Sallie said, "I was running away, and also running towards something. Both can be true." Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking out at the evening prairie. "Do you think there would be room for me out here? Not here specifically, but in the West, for someone like me?" Sallie looked at her sister and felt a particular, older sister love that was also respect, because the question took courage to ask. "Yes," she said, I think the West has room for anyone willing to be honest about what they need and willing to work for it. Margaret wrote 6 months later that she was considering a teaching post in Colorado, and Sallie wrote back a letter of thorough support. Margaret did go to Colorado, to a town called Pueblo, and found her own life there and her own person eventually, which is another story but a good one. Sallie taught school in Harlan's Creek through 1882, by which point the school had grown to 24 students, and the county had been discussing the appointment of a second teacher, and the town itself had grown to the point where the single general store had been joined by a hardware store, a new and larger saloon, a proper doctor's office, and a telegraph station, which connected Harlan's Creek to the wider world with a speed that still seemed remarkable to Sallie every time she walked past it. She was expecting again in the fall of 1882, and the second child, a daughter, came in the spring of 1883, a May morning when the prairie was green and the wind was from the south, warm and fragrant in a way that felt like a promise. They named her Clara Ruth, for Mrs. Boone and for Ruth Cobb, who were the women who had made Harlan's Creek home for Sallie, and both women received the news of the namesake with the specific dignity of people who are moved, and not going to admit it directly but show it in every other way. Clara Boone sent the largest and most elaborate quilt Sallie had ever seen, clearly weeks of work. Ruth Cobb arrived at the ranch the morning after the birth with a week's worth of meals in covered dishes, and stayed for 3 days to help. Clara Ruth Hale had her father's level dark eyes and her mother's particular quality of focused attention, and she studied the world from the first with the expression of someone taking careful notes. James, 3.5 and intensely interested in everything, regarded his sister initially with the cautious assessment of someone encountering something new in his territory, and then, as weeks passed, with a growing and somewhat proprietary affection that manifested itself as a constant need to be near her and to show her things. The spring of 1883 was also the spring that Roy came to Sallie with a proposal about the ranch, which was the other kind of proposal he made, practical and carefully considered, and presented with the same honesty he brought to everything. He wanted to build a new barn, larger than the existing one, to accommodate the expansion of the herd that the current year's finances made possible. It would cost money and labor and several months of disruption, and he had thought through the costs and the benefits, and he wanted her opinion, not her permission but her genuine opinion, because the ranch was theirs and the decisions were shared. Sallie had been helping him with the ranch's accounts since the first winter, because she had a clarity with numbers that complemented his practical knowledge, and she looked at the figures he laid out, and said she thought the barn was the right decision, and here were 2 things he had not calculated, and here was how she would approach the timeline to minimize disruption during the summer pasturing. Roy listened to all of it and incorporated what was useful and asked questions about the rest, and they sat at the kitchen table in the early morning with coffee and their children sleeping and the ranch outside the window and worked it out together, the way they worked everything out, and the barn was built by September and stood for decades. Roy's ranch hand Diego Vasquez, who had been with the Double H for 3 years by 1883, left in the autumn of that year for reasons that were good ones. He had saved enough to buy a small piece of land west of Harlan's Creek and was starting his own operation. Roy and Sallie attended the small celebration he held, and Roy helped him through the first few months with advice and the loan of equipment, and Diego's operation thrived, which was a satisfaction to everyone involved. He was replaced at the ranch by 2 new hands, brothers from Missouri named Frank and Eli Burchard, who were steady and capable, and added a specific quality of good-natured loud argumentation to the bunkhouse that Pete Cobb, accustomed to quieter company, initially found trying and then grew fond of. The school in Harlan's Creek got its second teacher in the spring of 1884, a young woman named Miss Drummond who came from Topeka, and was clearly somewhat startled by the realities of a small prairie town. Sallie found herself in the position of mentor, which she had not expected and which she took seriously, showing Miss Drummond the particular adjustments required for teaching children whose daily lives were shaped by agricultural work, and whose absences during planting and harvest were not delinquency but necessity. Miss Drummond turned out to be a quick learner and a genuinely dedicated teacher, and by the end of her first year had found her footing, and she and Sallie settled into the comfortable professional relationship of two women who shared a vocation and respected each other's competence. The letter from Edmund Fitch came in the summer of 1884, which was 6 years after Sallie had left Cincinnati, and it arrived addressed to Miss Sallie Leland, care of the Harlan's Creek Post Office, so it had clearly been sent before he knew she was married, and it had been forwarded from her parents' address in Cincinnati, which meant it had taken some time to find her. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately and felt nothing dramatic, which surprised her. She had expected, if this moment ever came, something more complicated. What she felt was mostly a dull, settled indifference, like looking at a painting you once thought was significant and finding that it has simply faded. She opened the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Roy across from her, and she said, "This is from Edmund Fitch," and Roy looked up from the newspaper and said, "Do you want to read it alone?" She said, "No, I do not think it matters." She read it. Edmund Fitch wrote in the smooth, careful prose she remembered, and what he said was that he and Agnes had been legally separated, and that he had spent years regretting what he had done, and that he hoped Sallie had found her way, and that if she had not, he would like to write to her again and perhaps, in time, to see her. She put the letter down and looked at Roy across the kitchen table, at the man who had put on his hat and driven through 6 inches of snow for his ranch hand's sick wife, at the man who had stood still and quiet in a general store and told a bully very simply not to do that again, at the man who had said "Thank you, Sallie," when she had said yes, and she said, "He wants to know if I would like to correspond with him." Roy said, "What do you want?" She said, to write him a polite and final reply, and then never think about him again. Roy nodded once and went back to his newspaper, and Sallie got out her writing paper and wrote Edmund Fitch a letter that was kind in tone and absolute in content, telling him that she had built a life, and that it was a good one, and that she wished him well and that this would be her only response. She sealed the letter and mailed it the next day, and that was the end of Edmund Fitch, and it was, as it turned out, not a complicated ending at all. She told Roy that evening on the porch, the summer evening settling cool around the warm stone of the house, James running in the yard and Clara Ruth on a blanket examining a grasshopper with intense concentration, that she was glad the letter had come because it had told her something she had wondered about. She had wondered whether Edmund Fitch still had any power over her, any reach into the place where the hurt had been, and now she knew he did not, and that was useful information. Roy listened and then said, "You have been all the way here for a long time, Sallie. He stopped having any reach into anything the minute you got on that train, if not before." She looked at him. "When did you know that?" He thought about it in the deliberate way he thought about things. "About 3 weeks after I met you," he said. "You had a way of looking at the horizon that was not looking back. I noticed it." She laughed. She laughed the way she had been laughing for 6 years in Harlan's Creek, with the ease of a woman who has found the right geography for her life, the internal kind and the actual kind both. "3 weeks after you met me," she said. "That was June of 1878. I was still being very sensible about you." "I know," he said with that particular quiet amusement. "I could tell. You never said anything." "No," he agreed. "I was waiting." "For what?" He looked at her with those level dark eyes that she had looked into for 6 years without finding their bottom, that she thought she could look into for 60 more years and still be finding new depth in, and he said, "For you to be ready. You had come a long way. I could wait." James came running across the yard then, and threw himself at his father with the full-body confidence of a 4-year-old who has never had reason to doubt his welcome. And Roy caught him and swung him up. And Clara Ruth looked up from her grasshopper and made a sound of protest at being left out. And Sallie picked her up and stood on the porch of the Double H with her daughter in her arms and her husband and son in front of her, and the Kansas evening going amber and rose over the western horizon. And she thought that the thing she had run from in February of 1878 had done her an unintentional kindness. Edmund Fitch, with his broken promise and his clever pale eyes and his particular talent for saying things that were not true, had driven her to a train platform and a one-way ticket and a vast, terrifying, magnificent sky. And at the end of that sky there had been a man who was real in every way that mattered. She had said as much to Mrs. Boone once, in an unguarded moment over coffee in the general store, and Clara Boone had said, in her matter-of-fact way, "The West has that quality. It strips everything back to what is real. That is frightening if you are a person who has been living on false things, and clarifying if you are not." Sallie had thought about that for a long time after. She was not a person who had been living on false things, but she had been a person who had been deceived, which was different. And the West and Roy Hale and the honest, specific life they had built together had clarified for her the difference between those two conditions, with a thoroughness that she was grateful for. James started school in September of 1884, his mother's school, which required a particular negotiation of the overlap between being a student's mother and that student's teacher, a negotiation that Sallie managed by being completely consistent in both roles and by having a son who was enough like his father to deal with the situation with his own brand of practical equanimity. He was good at numbers, as Tommy Cobb had been good at numbers, and he was good at drawing maps, and he struggled initially with spelling in the specific way that children who are more interested in ideas than in their exact written form often do. And Sallie taught him the same way she taught everyone else, patiently, and with the conviction that the ability was there, and the method was just the finding of it. Clara Ruth, at 18 months, had developed a personality that was formidable by any standard. She had opinions about everything in her immediate world and communicated them with great expressiveness, and she had discovered that her father would give her most things she indicated she wanted if she looked at him with sufficient intensity, and she used this knowledge without restraint. Roy knew this and capitulated anyway, which was the least surprising thing in the world to Sallie, and when she pointed it out, he agreed entirely and showed no sign of changing his approach, and she loved him so specifically for it that it was almost painful. The Christmas of 1884 was the largest gathering the Double H had seen. Sallie's parents came out from Cincinnati for the second time, and Margaret came down from Pueblo, Colorado, bringing with her a man named Elliot Barrett who was, it was clear from the first hour of his arrival, completely devoted to her in exactly the way that he should be. Pete and Ruth Cobb came with Tommy, who was now 14 and had grown into a quiet, confident young man with a genuine head for mathematics. Mrs. Boone came out with her sons. Diego Vasquez came with his wife Maria, whom he had married in 1884 and who was expecting their first child in the spring. Frank and Eli Burchard were there, their loud brotherly argument temporarily suspended in honor of the occasion. The house was full in a way that would have been impossible in the small stone structure of 6 years earlier, because Roy had added 2 rooms to the house in 1882, anticipating exactly this kind of gathering with the foresight that characterized him. And the kitchen table had been extended with a board and horses to seat 15 people, and the food was what happened when Ruth Cobb and Sallie's mother collaborated, which was something close to miraculous. There was a Christmas tree cut from the stand of cedars north of the house and decorated with paper ornaments that Sallie's school class had made, and with candles that were lit only briefly, and with someone watching, because a stone house was still a house with a wooden floor, and Roy had opinions about fire safety. After the supper, when the children were settled and the men were outside looking at the clear winter sky, and talking about ranching in the way that men who work the land talk about it when they are at ease. Sallie sat with her mother and her sister and Mrs. Boone and Ruth Cobb around the fire, and the conversation moved in the warm, easy way of women who are comfortable together, and her mother said, with the particular emotion of a parent who has watched a child be brave and been rewarded for it, "You look so well, Sallie. You look entirely yourself." Sallie said, "I am. For the first time in a long time, I think I really am." Her mother reached over and took her hand the way she had taken her hand when Sallie was a small girl and something had been difficult, and held it for a moment. And Sallie let herself be a daughter in that moment without giving up any of the other things she was, which was the gift of a good family, the ability to hold all the versions of yourself at once. Roy came back inside and caught her eye across the room, and smiled at her with the smile she had seen for the first time on a Friday afternoon in a general store, when she had said something about finding children's hidden talents. And it was still the same smile, still capable of doing the slow, complicated thing to her chest. And she smiled back with the full ease of a woman who has nothing to protect herself from. The winter of 1885 was a quiet one after the Christmas gathering, and Sallie used the quiet well. She had been thinking for some time about writing, not fiction but something practical, a guide for women considering the Western territories, the realities of it, what to expect and what to prepare for, and where to find the unexpected gifts of it. She had talked to Roy about it, and he had said, with genuine interest, that he thought it was a good idea, and that there was probably no one better positioned to write it. She began in February, writing in the evenings after James and Clara Ruth were in bed, at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, and what came out was honest and specific and frequently funny in the dry way of someone describing hard things from the position of having come through them. She wrote about the train journey and the shock of the first week. She wrote about the size of the sky and the way the silence was not empty but full of things. She wrote about the quality of a Kansas winter and the precise way you learn to manage it. She wrote about what it meant to be a woman in a small western town, the genuine independence of it alongside the genuine difficulty, the ways the West was harder than the East in its physical demands and freer in its social ones, the way a woman with a skill and the willingness to work it could carve out a life of real substance. She wrote about the children she had taught and what they had taught her. She did not write about Edmund Fitch by name, but she wrote about the uses of a fresh start, the way that distance from a broken thing could give you the perspective to see what had actually been wrong with it and what you actually needed instead. She sent the manuscript to a journal in Kansas City that had been publishing pieces about Western life, and they wrote back asking to publish it in 3 installments, and they paid her $15 for it, which was more than she had expected, and which Roy responded to by telling everyone in Harlan's Creek, which she found both embarrassing and deeply endearing. The spring of 1885 brought the expected and the unexpected in roughly equal measure. Diego and Maria Vasquez had their son in March, a healthy boy they named Samuel, and the celebration at their small ranch to the west of Harlan's Creek was warm and well attended, and Sallie held baby Samuel and thought about the morning James had arrived 6 years earlier and marveled at the specific and unrepeatable nature of each of these moments. The unexpected thing was that Clara Boone's health began to decline in April, not dramatically but steadily, a tiredness that the sharp, efficient woman had never allowed for before, and a persistent cough that the doctor treated without being able to cure. Sallie visited her every week and spent as much time as she could manage in the general store, which Clara's sons were increasingly running, sitting with Clara in the back room over tea and talking in the way they had always talked, directly and with affection. Clara Boone said to Sallie one afternoon in May, "I am not afraid of it. I want you to know that. I have had a good life and I have done most of what I set out to do, and the things I did not get to do are not things I am grieving excessively." Sallie said, "I would not have made it here without you." Mrs. Boone said, "Yes, you would have. You had the bones of it already when you stepped off that train. I just helped you find the door." She died in July of 1885, on a warm evening with the windows open, her sons and Sallie and Roy and several others around her. And she went with the same practical quietness that had characterized everything she did. The town mourned her in the genuine, specific way of a community that has lost someone who was genuinely central to it. And the gathering at the church was full, and person after person stood up and told the specific thing that Clara Boone had done for them: the direct help, the loan of money or time or equipment, the sharp-eyed practical advice, the complete absence of sentimentality that was somehow its own form of warmth. Sallie sat in the front pew with Roy's hand in hers and listened and cried without embarrassment, because Clara Boone would not have wanted pretense, and Sallie was not capable of it anyway where she was concerned. She went back to school in September with Clara Boone's name in her heart and taught the 26 children of Harlan's Creek with the same energy and conviction she had always brought, because that was what Clara Boone would have said to do. Miss Drummond taught the younger children and Sallie the older ones, and the school was becoming something real and lasting, the kind of institution that outlives any particular teacher. Sallie knew she would not teach forever, that the children at the ranch would eventually need more of her time, and the ranch itself would grow in its demands. But she also knew that the school and the children of Harlan's Creek were part of what she had built here, and she was not ready to let it go yet. And so she did not. James, at 6 years old, was beginning to show the first clear signs of what he would become, which was someone who combined his mother's quickness with his father's patience in a proportion that was unique to himself. He had Roy's way with animals and Sallie's way with people, and his own particular way of solving problems that involved a period of apparent inaction that was actually very rapid internal processing, followed by a clear, decisive action that made the adults around him look at each other with something between surprise and recognition. He was, all things considered, a joy, which Sallie said to Roy one evening, and Roy said, "Yes," with the simple completeness of a man who has everything he needs and knows it. Clara Ruth, at 2, was becoming a walking argument for the idea that personality was mostly fixed at birth, because she had been forceful and curious and indefatigable from the first moments, and showed no signs of softening any of these qualities. She followed her brother everywhere and demanded inclusion in everything, and had recently discovered that she could open most of the doors in the house if she applied both hands and sufficient determination, which she then demonstrated by opening all of them in sequence several times a day. Roy had responded to this by making sure none of the doors she should not open were left anywhere near her reach, which was the kind of architectural consideration that life with Clara Ruth Hale generated on a regular basis. In the autumn of 1885, Roy told Sallie that he was thinking of taking James with him on a short ride out to the north pasture, a half day, just to show him the land and the cattle. Sallie said that James would love nothing more, and he did. He came back with his father in the late afternoon, sitting straight in the saddle, on a small gray pony that Roy had purchased quietly and without announcement from a rancher to the east, and his face was the face of a boy who has been given the exact right thing, and he talked for an hour about everything he had seen, and when could they go again. Roy watched him talk with an expression that Sallie kept to herself the way she kept certain things, not because they were secret, but because some things were too full to share, too complete and whole in themselves to survive being turned into words. They went many times after that. Saturday mornings became James and Roy mornings, and Sallie and Clara Ruth had the kitchen and the yard and the hours to themselves. And Clara Ruth, who would do anything her brother did, and had discovered she could not yet do this particular thing, diverted her considerable energy into the kitchen garden, with an enthusiasm that resulted in a certain amount of pulled-up bean seedlings before the full implications of what plants required to grow were thoroughly understood. The years settled into the good rhythm of a life that is fully inhabited, more children came to the school. The town of Harlan's Creek grew in the steady way of a place that has found its ground, new families arriving each year. A second store, a proper hotel, a newspaper that began publishing in 1886, small and local and passionate about the issues of the Kansas Territory in the way that Western newspapers were. Sallie wrote for it occasionally, pieces about education and community, and the editor, a wiry young man named Harlan Green who had named himself after the town rather than the other way around, as he cheerfully admitted, gave her as much space as she needed and argued with her editorial opinions with the relish of a man who considers disagreement a form of respect. Roy expanded the herd once more in 1886, and by 1887, the Double H was running close to 800 head, which made it one of the larger operations in the county, not enormous by the standards of the cattle kings further south and west, but solid and well managed, and with a reputation for the quality of its stock that had been built over nearly 20 years since Roy's father had first broken ground. Roy talked sometimes about the future of the cattle industry, the changes that the railroads were bringing, the barbed wire that was changing the open range, the farming settlers who were arriving in increasing numbers and whose interests were not always aligned with the ranching interests. And these were real tensions in Kansas in the 1880s, real conflicts over land and water and the shape of the territory's future, and Roy navigated them with the same practicality he brought to everything, adjusting without dramatic resistance to the things that were clearly going to change, and holding firmly to the things that were worth holding to. Sallie's journal pieces had been collected, and a small Kansas City publisher had expressed interest in a book, which was something she had not anticipated and which took her several months to take seriously enough to pursue. Roy, who took everything she did seriously, had told her from the first that she should do it and had arranged his calendar, and enlisted Ruth Cobb's help with the children on the evenings she needed to write, without making it into a sacrifice or a favor, but simply as the organization of a shared life that could accommodate both of them fully. The book was finished in the summer of 1887, 80 pages of honest, clear-eyed, occasionally funny writing about the experience of coming west and what it asked of a person and what it gave back, and the publisher brought it out in the spring of 1888, and it found readers, not a large number but a real one, women primarily, some of whom wrote to Sallie through the publisher, and whose letters she answered when she could. One of those letters was from a woman in Ohio, 22 years old, who said she had read the book twice and was thinking about going west and was afraid, and was the fear something you got through or something you had to make peace with. Sallie wrote back a long letter that took her 3 evenings to compose, because she wanted to get it right. She said that the fear was both, that you got through the parts of it that were temporary, the newness and the strangeness and the shock of difference, and you made peace with the parts of it that were permanent, the vastness and the uncertainty and the way the West stripped you back to what was essential, and that once you had made that peace you discovered it was not a loss but a gain, and that the woman on the other side of that passage was someone you would be glad to meet. She signed the letter Sallie Hale, Harlan's Creek, Kansas, and felt the rightness of those 3 words together, the name and the town and the state, the whole compressed geography of the life she had built. James turned 9 in September of 1888 and had, as Roy's father had apparently done at the same age, decided that ranching was what he was going to do with his life, a decision he communicated with the definiteness of someone who has looked at the question from all sides and is not entertaining argument. Sallie did not argue. She said that he should do his arithmetic and his reading too, because a good rancher needed to understand numbers and contracts and the way the wider world worked, and James, who respected the logic of a thing, agreed and applied himself to school with the specific motivation of someone who knows why they are learning what they are learning. Clara Ruth turned 5 in May of 1888 and started school in September of the same year, in Miss Drummond's room, by Sally's careful arrangement, because teaching your own daughter was an exercise in complications that she had thought through and decided against. Clara Ruth was furious about this for exactly 1 week, and then became Miss Drummond's most demanding and most rewarding student, which was exactly what everyone who knew her had predicted. The Christmas of 1888 was quiet by comparison to the large gathering of 1884, a family Christmas, just the four of them and Pete and Ruth and Tommy Cobb, Tommy now 18 and working full-time at the Double H, and being quietly and carefully trained by Roy for the role of foreman that he would eventually take on. The evening was warm and the children were asleep, and the adults sat around the fire, and Sally looked at the room. The stone walls that had been built by Roy's father and maintained by Roy's care. The fire that had been burning in this room through Kansas winters for nearly 20 years. The man beside her who was older now around the eyes and on his hands but unchanged in the essentials. The things that had made her look at him on a Friday afternoon in 1878 and feel that inconvenient, irresistible pull. And she thought that this was the end of the running and the end of the broken promise and the beginning of everything that had come after, and that everything that had come after was more than she had known how to want before she had come west and found out that she could want it. Roy looked over at her in the firelight and said quietly, "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I am glad I came west." He said, "So am I." And the simplicity of it was everything as it always had been with him. She took his hand and held it, and the fire burned and the Kansas night pressed cold and enormous against the windows of the Double H. And inside the house there was every kind of warmth that a person needed. The warmth of walls well built and fires well tended and children sleeping soundly, and a man beside you who was honest and good and real in all the ways that a man could be real. Roy Hale had been at the end of a trail Sally had not known she was on until she was halfway down it, and he had been there with his level eyes and his patient certainty, and his one word "thank you" and his bolt of blue silk from Abilene, and his way of making things stop without raising his voice, and his habit of knowing what she needed and arranging it without fanfare. And she had found him at the end of the running, and at the beginning of everything else. And the everything else had turned out to be the realest thing she had ever touched. She would teach in the Harlan's Creek School for 4 more years, until 1892, when James was 13, and the ranch was large enough that her involvement in its management was both needed and wanted, and she stepped away from the schoolroom with pride in what she had built there, and without regret, because stepping towards something is different from stepping away from something, and she had never stopped knowing the difference. Miss Drummond, by then, was fully capable of running the school with the third teacher who had been hired in 1890, a young man from Topeka named Mr. Wells who had an excellent head for geography, and the school was more than fine without her, which was the goal. In her last year of teaching, she stood at the front of the schoolroom on the last day before the summer break and looked at the 28 children in front of her, and thought about the first day she had stood in that cleaned and arranged room and written her name on the chalkboard, Sallie Leland, a woman who had come west on a train with a carpetbag and a broken promise, and something that had turned out to be braver than she had known at the time. She told the children that summer was coming and they were to read, and to pay attention to the world around them, and to come back in September ready to learn more. She told them that learning was the thing that no one could take from you. She told them that they lived in a remarkable place and a remarkable time, and they should not take either for granted. She told them, with more feeling than she had intended to let through, that they had been a genuine privilege to teach. She erased her name from the chalkboard for the last time and walked home across the flat, familiar Kansas afternoon, the town of Harlan's Creek around her, its weathered buildings and its newer ones, its telegraph wire and its hotel and its newspaper office and its church, and the spot where the general store of Boone and Sons had become Boone and Sons and Daughters, since Clara Boone's older son had brought his daughter into the business. The hitching posts and the horses and the wide blue sky overhead that had shocked her the first time she saw it, and still, 14 years later, moved her if she remembered to look at it without habit, and she walked home to the Double H and Roy and James. And Clara Ruth and the life she had come all this way to find, and she found them exactly where she had left them, and she was home. The land north of Harlan's Creek in the summer of 1892 was golden and still and enormous, and the Double H sat in it the way things that belong in a place sit, rooted and right. And Sallie Leland Hale stood on the porch she had stood on dozens of seasons, and watched her husband ride in from the north pasture with their son beside him, both of them straight in the saddle, the horses moving at an easy walk in the afternoon heat. James at 13 already, with something of his father's quality in the saddle, that particular ease that was not negligence but complete comfort. And behind the main house, she could hear Clara Ruth in the kitchen garden which she had taken back from the bean seedling, era and made into something productive and well-organized, talking to the cat that had appeared at the ranch the previous winter, and had been immediately and permanently adopted. Roy saw her on the porch when they rode into the yard, and he raised a hand, that single gesture of acknowledgement that was also its own kind of greeting, and Sallie raised hers back, and James waved with both arms because he was 13 and still willing to be expressive, and she laughed and waved back, and it was the most ordinary moment of an ordinary day in a life so full and real that she sometimes felt the weight of her gratitude for it like something physical, like the Kansas wind, always present, always reminding her of where she was and how she had gotten here and what she had found when she arrived. There were more years ahead. There were years she could not see yet, full of things she could not predict, the way all the best years are. But there was also this, the porch boards warm under her feet, and the sky going amber at the edges, and her family coming in from the land, and the town behind her that was her place, and the life around her that was her life, all of it real, all of it true, every last piece of it built from the honest work of a woman who had once gotten on a train running from a broken promise, and had found at the end of the trail that the most real thing in the world was waiting for her. And she had been brave enough to stay.